After 18 months of leading my data security platform from concept to completion, bringing in $5 million in pre-orders, I walked into our company-wide meeting expecting recognition. Instead, I watched in stunned silence as my manager, Richard Parker, stood confidently at the podium, presenting my work as his own. "My revolutionary approach to quantum encryption," he said, smiling at the CEO. My heart sank, but I forced myself to smile. The following Tuesday changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights of Meridian Technologies' main conference room seemed unusually harsh that morning. Every senior executive, department head, and team leader sat around the massive oak table, eyes fixed on the projection screen displaying our quarterly results. I'd been with Meridian for nearly 7 years, but this was the first time I'd been invited to the quarterly all-hands leadership meeting. Not because I'd suddenly been promoted, I was still technically a senior software architect, but because the project I'd been leading for the past 18 months was finally being unveiled to our entire leadership team. The CyberShield Platform. My baby, my creation, my sleepless nights and missed weekends, my solution to the impossible security problems our industry had been facing for years. I sat near the back of the room, nervous but proud. Our CEO, Diana Wells, was known for her no-nonsense approach and razor-sharp business acumen. At 58, with silver-streaked black hair always pulled into a tight bun, she'd built Meridian from a small consulting firm into a leading cybersecurity company valued at over $800 million. She didn't suffer fools or tolerate failure, but she also rewarded innovation and results, which is exactly what CyberShield promised to deliver. Next on the agenda, Diana announced, glancing at her tablet, is the CyberShield Platform update. This represents our largest R&D investment of the past 2 years, and, according to early client feedback, could potentially redefine our market position. She looked up, scanning the room. "Richard, you're up." My direct manager, Richard Parker, rose from his seat near the front. At 45, Richard had the polished look of someone who spent more time in client meetings than actually working on technology. His perfectly tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than my monthly salary. His salt and pepper hair was expertly styled to project authority while hiding his receding hairline. I'd reported to him for the past 3 years, and had learned that while Richard was an excellent salesman, his technical understanding was superficial at best. Which is why I'd been the one to develop CyberShield from the ground up. Richard clicked to the first slide of my presentation, the one I'd spent the entire weekend perfecting, and smiled confidently at the room. "As some of you know, I've been leading a special project for the past 1.5 years," he began. I felt a small twinge in my chest. Leading? He'd attended maybe 4 development meetings in 18 months. When I first conceptualized CyberShield, I knew we needed to approach security differently. The twinge became a knot. Conceptualized? The entire project had sparked from my research paper that I'd submitted to our innovation program, a paper Richard had initially dismissed as too theoretical. I glanced around the room, wondering if anyone else noticed the deception unfolding. Most executives were focused on Richard or their notes. Only my colleague Natalie Wong from the engineering department caught my eye. She raised an eyebrow slightly, her expression mirroring my disbelief. Richard continued smoothly, clicking through my slides, using my exact phrasing from the executive summary I'd written, even my analogies to explain the complex technical concepts, all while never once mentioning my name or the team of engineers who had worked tirelessly under my direction. My approach to quantum-resistant algorithms represents a fundamental shift in how we protect sensitive data, he said, gesturing to a diagram I had created to simplify the complex mathematics for a non-technical audience. My approach? The room suddenly felt too warm. I could feel a flush creeping up my neck, my hands clenching involuntarily under the table. This wasn't just taking credit for my work. This was Richard completely erasing my existence from a project that had consumed my professional life for a year and a half. The worst part? It was working. I could see heads nodding, executives leaning forward with interest. Diana Wells herself was watching Richard with something approaching approval, a rare expression from our notoriously difficult-to-impress CEO. The market validation has been extraordinary, Richard continued, clicking to the slide showing our pilot program results. 5 million in pre-orders from existing clients, with another 12 million in the pipeline. My projections suggest we'll hit 20 million in new revenue within the first year of full deployment. My projections. Those numbers had come from the financial models I'd stayed up 3 nights straight to complete last month. I should have said something. Should have stood up, cleared my throat, corrected this blatant misrepresentation. But I remained frozen. A lifetime of being the quiet, reliable team player keeping me rooted to my seat. I'd been raised by immigrant parents who had instilled in me the values of hard work, humility, and respect for authority. Keep your head down and let your work speak for itself, my father always said. But what happens when someone else claims your work as their speech? As Richard fielded questions about technical details, stumbling slightly before recovering with vague answers or promises to follow up with specifics, I felt something shift inside me. A slow burn replacing the initial shock. This wasn't right. This wasn't fair. And for the first time in my professional life, I wasn't sure if I could just smile and take it. The meeting concluded with Diana expressing cautious optimism about CyberShield's potential. If these numbers hold up, Richard, this could be a game changer for us. Good work. I want weekly updates on the rollout timeline. Good work, Richard. Not good work, Olivia. Not good work, team. Just Richard. As people began gathering their materials and filtering out of the conference room, Natalie made her way to my side. That was... She hesitated, keeping her voice low. Yeah, I replied, unable to articulate the complex emotions swirling inside me. You're not going to say anything? She pressed, her dark eyes searching my face. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I shook my head slightly, gathering my notebook. What would I say? Call him out in front of the entire leadership team? Challenge him publicly? It's your project, Olivia. Everyone on the technical side knows that. The technical side isn't the problem, I said, watching as Richard accepted congratulations from the chief revenue officer. It's everyone else. Natalie followed my gaze, her expression hardening. This isn't the first time he's done this, you know. Marcus in AI research had the same thing happen last year with the predictive analytics module. This wasn't surprising, but it still added to my growing anger. What did Marcus do? Nothing, Natalie said flatly. He quit 3 months later. Works at Google now. A coward's way out, a small voice whispered in my mind, but also the simplest. With my experience and the results of CyberShield in my portfolio, assuming I could somehow prove it was actually my work, I could probably land a position at any tech company in Seattle. Richard caught my eye across the room and gave me a small nod, as if acknowledging a minor contribution. The same nod he might give to someone who had prepared the coffee for the meeting. The burn inside me intensified. As I left the conference room, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from Richard, sent to the entire CyberShield development team. Team, as you may have heard, the CyberShield presentation to leadership was extremely well received. Diana herself expressed enthusiasm about our direction. Thank you all for your various contributions to this initiative. I'd especially like to acknowledge Olivia Chen for her technical support throughout the development process. Let's keep up the momentum as we move into implementation. Richard Parker, Director of Product Security, Meridian Technologies. Technical support? I had architected the entire platform, led every development meeting, written every line of the core algorithm, and personally solved the quantum vulnerability problem that had stumped our industry for years. And Richard was acknowledging my technical support? I stood in the hallway, staring at my phone, a strange calm replacing the anger. This wasn't just unfair, it was absurd, almost comically so. And something inside me, some boundary I hadn't even realized existed, finally broke. In that moment, standing in the sterile corporate hallway of Meridian Technologies, I made a decision. I wouldn't quit. I wouldn't flee to Google or Amazon or Microsoft. I wouldn't start over somewhere new, carrying this defeat with me like a shadow. No. Richard Parker had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He had stolen from the wrong person. He just didn't know it yet. Back at my desk, I tried to focus on work, but my mind kept replaying Richard's presentation. My innovation and my approach echoed in my head, fueling a slow-burning determination I hadn't felt in years. I opened my personal email and began composing a message to myself, documenting everything that had happened in the meeting while it was still fresh. Hey, holding up okay? I looked up to see Jason Rodriguez, one of the senior developers who had worked with me on CyberShield, leaning against my cubicle wall. His usually cheerful face was creased with concern. "I'm fine," I said automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, no, I'm not fine. Did you see Richard's email?" Jason grimaced. "Yeah, technical support was a nice touch. Real classy." He presented the entire project as his own, Jason. Every slide, every concept, every projection, like I was some minor contributor who helped with formatting or something. Jason glanced around before pulling up a chair beside my desk. "Look, everyone who matters knows the truth. The entire development team knows who really built CyberShield. But that's not who makes the decisions around here, is it?" I countered. "The people who approve promotions, who decide compensation, who determine the future of my career, they all just heard that Richard Parker is some kind of technical genius who single-handedly solved quantum security." Jason didn't argue. He couldn't. We both knew how corporate politics worked at Meridian. "So what are you going to do?" he asked finally. I took a deep breath. "I'm not entirely sure yet, but I'm not just going to let this go." Jason nodded, slowly. "Whatever you decide, you've got allies. The whole team saw what happened today." He stood up, giving my shoulder a supportive squeeze before heading back to his desk. I turned back to my computer, but instead of continuing my documentation, I opened a new browser tab and navigated to Meridian's internal document repository. I began methodically downloading every email, every meeting note, every development log, every code commit, and every prototype result related to CyberShield. If I was going to fight back, I needed ammunition. By late afternoon, I had compiled an extensive digital paper trail proving my role as the true architect of CyberShield. Email threads showing my original concept proposal. Calendar invites for the dozens of development meetings I had led. Documentation with tracked changes showing my revisions. Code repositories with my commit history. Even performance reviews where Richard himself had praised my leadership on the project. The evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible, but what to do with it? Going to HR seemed like the obvious first step, but I knew how these things typically played out. Richard was a director with a decade of seniority at Meridian. I was a senior engineer, talented but ultimately replaceable in the eyes of upper management. It would become a he said, she said situation, with power and politics likely to prevail over truth. I needed more than just evidence. I needed leverage. As I was contemplating my next move, my computer pinged with a calendar invitation. CyberShield Client Demonstration, Apex Financial Group. Thursday, 1 to 3 p.m. conference room. A required attendees: Richard Parker, Diana Wells, Michael Thompson, CTO. Apex Financial was one of our largest potential clients, with a security infrastructure budget that could single-handedly make CyberShield profitable in its first quarter. This wasn't just any client demonstration. This was the demonstration. Another email popped up almost immediately after, this one directly from Richard. Olivia, I'll need you to prepare the technical demonstration for Apex on Thursday. Please have all materials ready for my review by tomorrow afternoon. You don't? Need to attend the actual meeting? I'll handle the client-facing presentation. RP, of course. He needed me to do all the complicated technical work, the actual demonstration that would show CyberShield's capabilities, but had no intention of letting me present it to the client, or even attend the meeting. I stared at the email for a long moment, then did something I had never done before in my professional career. I hit reply and wrote, Richard, I'll prepare the demonstration as requested. However, given the technical complexity involved, I believe it would be beneficial for me to attend the meeting to support any detailed questions that might arise during the demonstration. Best, Olivia. My finger hovered over the send button. This was a small act of rebellion, but it felt momentous. I was directly challenging Richard's attempt to exclude me. Taking a deep breath, I clicked send before I could second-guess myself. Richard's response came less than 5 minutes later. That won't be necessary. I'm fully capable of handling any technical questions. Just have the materials ready by tomorrow, 3 p.m. RP. I leaned back in my chair, a wry smile forming despite my frustration. Of course he wouldn't want me there. My presence would immediately expose his limited understanding of the technology he was claiming to have developed. But his response had given me an idea. The next morning, I arrived at the office earlier than usual. The development floor was nearly empty, just a few dedicated engineers who, like me, preferred the quiet productivity of the early hours. I went straight to my desk and began working on the Apex demonstration, meticulously building a showcase that would highlight CyberShield's most impressive capabilities. But I was also working on something else, something that had come to me during a mostly sleepless night. At precisely 2:57 p.m., I walked to Richard's office with a USB drive containing the completed demonstration materials. His door was open, and I could see him on the phone, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. When he noticed me, he held up one finger in the universal "wait a minute" sign. I stood in the doorway, USB drive in hand, listening to his side of what was clearly a sales call. Absolutely, John. I built CyberShield specifically with regulatory compliance in mind, Richard was saying, making eye contact with me while continuing his conversation. The quantum-resistant algorithm I developed ensures that even future quantum computing advances won't compromise your data. My expression remained neutral, but inside, my resolve strengthened. He was doubling down on his lie, spreading it beyond our company to potential clients. Finally, Richard wrapped up his call and beckoned me in. You have the demo ready? He asked, holding out his hand for the USB drive. Everything's here, I confirmed, handing it over. I've included detailed notes on the demonstration workflow and prepared answers to the most likely technical questions. Richard barely glanced at the notes I'd carefully prepared. Good. I'm sure it'll be fine. There is one aspect of the demonstration that's a bit tricky, I added, keeping my voice casual. The quantum simulation section requires precise timing with the parameter adjustments. If you'd like, I could quickly walk you through it. Richard waved a dismissive hand. I'm familiar with how it works, Olivia. I conceptualized the entire system, remember? It took everything in me not to react to his brazen lie stated directly to my face. Of course, I said evenly, just offering to help. Your technical support is appreciated, he replied, already turning his attention to his computer, effectively dismissing me. I left his office, my heart pounding not with anger, but with anticipation. Richard's arrogance was working in my favor. He hadn't even bothered to look at the demonstration materials, confident in his ability to wing it through a presentation about technology he barely understood. The trap was set. Thursday arrived, and I watched from my desk as Richard, Diana, and our CTO, Michael Thompson, headed toward Conference Room A for the Apex financial demonstration. Richard had his laptop under one arm and was talking animatedly to Diana, who nodded occasionally, her expression businesslike as always. 15 minutes into the scheduled meeting, my phone lit up with a message from Jason, who was working with another team in a neighboring conference room. Something's happening in the Apex meeting. Richard's looking panicked, and the CEO looks pissed. I took a deep breath. Right on schedule. 20 minutes later, my desk phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Diana Wells's assistant. Olivia Chen, I answered, keeping my voice professional. Ms. Chen, Diana Wells requests your immediate presence in Conference Room A. Please bring your laptop and any materials related to the CyberShield platform. I'll be right there, I said, already gathering my things. As I made my way to the conference room, I felt surprisingly calm. I'd anticipated this outcome, but seeing it actually unfold was still somewhat surreal. When I reached the door, I paused for just a moment, straightening my blazer and squaring my shoulders. Then I walked in. The tension in the room was palpable. Richard stood at the front, his demo screen frozen on what appeared to be an error message. His face was flushed, a sheen of sweat visible on his forehead. Diana sat at the head of the table, her expression thunderous. Michael Thompson, our CTO, looked somewhere between confused and suspicious. And 3 people in expensive suits, presumably the Apex financial representatives, appeared thoroughly unimpressed. "Ah, Olivia," Diana said crisply when she saw me. "Thank you for joining us. We're having some technical difficulties with the CyberShield demonstration. Since you provided technical support on this project, perhaps you can assist?" The pointed emphasis she placed on technical support told me everything I needed to know. Diana was no fool. She'd already begun to piece things together. "Of course," I said, moving to the front of the room. "What seems to be the problem?" Richard glared at me, a mixture of anger and panic in his eyes. "Just a minor technical glitch," he said tightly. "The quantum simulation module isn't responding correctly." I glanced at his screen and had to suppress a smile. It wasn't responding correctly, because the demonstration I'd prepared included a deliberate failsafe, a section that required specific knowledge of the algorithm to navigate successfully. Knowledge that only the actual developer would possess. "I see the issue," I said, connecting my own laptop to the projector. "If you don't mind, I can continue from here with my version of the demonstration." Richard started to object, but Diana cut him off. "Please proceed, Olivia." I launched into the demonstration, explaining each aspect of CyberShield with the deep understanding that comes from having built something from the ground up. I navigated smoothly through the section that had stumped Richard, explaining the quantum-resistant algorithm in terms that were technical enough to be credible, but clear enough for the non-technical executives to follow. The Apex representatives began to engage, asking increasingly complex questions that I answered with confidence and precision. Their body language shifted from skeptical to interested. Richard remained silent, seeming to shrink with each passing minute. Diana watched me with an intensity that might have been intimidating if I wasn't so focused on the presentation. When I finished the technical demonstration, the lead Apex executive, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, turned to Diana. "This is exactly the solution we've been looking for. Your team," she glanced pointedly at me, "has developed something truly innovative here." "Thank you," Diana replied, her eyes never leaving me. "Olivia has indeed created something remarkable." The emphasis on my name was unmistakable. In that moment, I knew that whatever happened next, the truth had been established. After we escorted the Apex team out, Diana turned to Richard and me. "Both of you, my office, 15 minutes. she said in a tone that brooked no argument. As the door closed behind her, Richard rounded on me. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. "You deliberately sabotaged the demonstration." "No, Richard," I replied calmly. "I simply designed it so that only someone who truly understood the technology could present it properly. Someone who had actually built it." "You think you're so clever," he snarled, "but this isn't over." "You're right," I agreed. "It's just beginning." I gathered my materials and walked out, leaving him standing there. For the first time in months, despite the uncertainty of what would happen in Diana's office, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The truth was finally coming to light, and I was ready to stand in it. Diana's office had always intimidated me. Unlike the sleek minimalism that dominated Meridian's workspace, her corner office was deliberately old school. Dark wood furniture, shelves lined with technical manuals and business books, and windows overlooking Seattle's skyline. No motivational posters, no tech industry cliches, just the understated gravitas of someone who didn't need to prove anything to anyone. I sat across from her imposing desk, my posture straight, but not rigid. Richard had chosen to sit as far from me as possible, his body angled away as if physical distance might somehow protect him from what was coming. Diana studied us both for a long moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. She'd removed her blazer, the sleeves of her cream blouse rolled up precisely to her elbows, her signature getting down to business look. "I've been CEO of Meridian Technologies for 16 years, she finally said, her voice measured. "In that time, I've dealt with corporate espionage, hostile takeover attempts, market crashes, and competitors stealing our talent. But I've never," she emphasized the word, "had to deal with one of my own directors deliberately misrepresenting someone else's work to me and our executive team." Richard shifted in his seat. "Diana, I can explain." "I'm not finished." She cut him off, her tone dropping several degrees colder. The Apex demonstration made it abundantly clear that there's a significant discrepancy between who presented CyberShield to leadership on Monday and who actually understands it. She turned her sharp gaze to me. "Olivia, I'd like to hear your version of events, from the beginning." I took a deep breath. This was my moment, the opportunity I'd been waiting for. But instead of launching into accusations, I decided on a different approach. "I joined the security research team 7 years ago," I began. 3 years into my tenure, I noticed a pattern in emerging quantum computing developments that suggested traditional encryption methods would be vulnerable much sooner than industry projections indicated. I explained how I'd written a research paper outlining both the problem and a potential solution, a paper I'd submitted through our innovation program. How initial feedback had been skeptical, including from Richard, who had deemed it too theoretical and not aligned with market demands. But the quantum threat kept me up at night, I continued. So I continued the research on my own time, developing proofs of concept and testing my theories. 6 months later, when Google announced their quantum supremacy breakthrough, suddenly quantum-resistant security became a priority. That's when Richard approached me about forming a small skunkworks team to explore my concepts further, I said, glancing at him. His face had paled slightly. He secured the initial funding, which I appreciated. But from that point on, I led the technical development. I architected the platform, wrote the core algorithms, led the engineering team, and personally solved the fundamental mathematical challenges. Diana nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving my face. "And the client outreach? The market validation? The 5 million in pre-orders?" "The technical breakthrough enabled everything else," I said carefully. Once we had a working prototype, I created the demonstration materials and conducted the initial presentations to our strategic clients. Richard handled some of the business negotiations and contract details, which was helpful. I was being generous, but burning bridges wouldn't serve me here. "I see." Diana turned to Richard. And your perspective? Richard straightened, adjusting his tie. The momentary panic I'd seen earlier had been replaced by something more calculated. Olivia is an exceptional technical talent, he began, his voice smoothly reasonable. Her contributions to CyberShield were certainly significant, but this characterization of her single-handedly developing the entire platform is, frankly, an exaggeration. I remained silent, letting him dig his own grave. As department director, I provided the strategic vision and executive oversight that shaped CyberShield from a theoretical concept into a marketable product. Yes, Olivia and her team handled the technical implementation, but without my guidance. On market requirements, client needs, and strategic positioning, CyberShield would have remained an academic exercise rather than the commercial success it's becoming. It was a clever angle, acknowledging my technical contribution while claiming the strategic vision and business success as his own. In many corporate environments, it might have worked. Technical people were often seen as mere implementers of the visionary ideas from management. Diana's expression revealed nothing. I appreciate both perspectives, she said neutrally. But what I need now are facts, not interpretations. She turned to her computer, typing briefly before swiveling the monitor so we could both see it. These are the official project records for CyberShield. Proposal documents, meeting minutes, code repositories, client presentations, everything. She looked at Richard. Would you like to explain why Olivia's name appears as the author or lead on approximately 87% of these materials? Or why the original proposal, the one you claimed to have conceptualized, was submitted to the innovation program under her name 6 months before you became involved? Richard's expression tightened. As I mentioned, Olivia handled most of the technical documentation. And these emails? Diana interrupted, pulling up a series of messages. Here's one from you to the executive committee last year. Olivia, Chen's innovative approach to quantum-resistant encryption has proven viable in initial testing. I'm requesting additional resources to support her continued development of this technology. She scrolled to another. Olivia's breakthrough could position Meridian as a leader in post-quantum security. She fixed Richard with a stare that would have wilted a less practiced corporate politician. That doesn't sound like someone describing their own concept being implemented by a subordinate. It sounds like someone advocating for their subordinate's innovation. Richard's facade finally began to crack. Diana, you have to understand the competitive pressures we're facing. The way these announcements are received is critical to market positioning. Having a director identified as the driving force behind CyberShield gives it more credibility with clients and investors than acknowledging the actual creator? Diana finished for him, her voice dangerously quiet. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard seemed to be calculating his next move, while Diana's expression had hardened into something I'd never seen directed at a member of her leadership team. Richard, I need to speak with Olivia alone, she said finally. We'll continue our discussion afterward. It wasn't a request. Richard hesitated for just a moment before standing, straightening his jacket with a dignity that seemed increasingly forced. Of course, he said stiffly, then left without looking at me. When the door closed behind him, Diana's posture relaxed fractionally. She leaned back in her chair, studying me with fresh intensity. I owe you an apology, Olivia, she said, surprising. Me. I pride myself on recognizing talent and contribution accurately. I missed this completely. You couldn't have known, I offered. Richard is very good at what he does. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. Yes, apparently what he does is take credit for other people's innovations. She shook her head slightly. But that's not your burden to ease. Tell me something. Why didn't you speak up during the leadership presentation? Or before? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself repeatedly. Honestly, A lifetime of conditioning to be the supportive team player, to not make waves, to believe that if I just did excellent work, recognition would follow naturally. I met her eyes. Also, practically speaking, it's Richard's word against mine, and he's a director while I'm a senior engineer. The power dynamic wasn't in my favor. Diana considered this, until the Apex demonstration forced the issue. I nodded. I designed the demonstration materials in a way that required intimate knowledge of the underlying technology to present successfully. It wasn't sabotage. Everything was there for someone who truly understood the system. Clever, she remarked, with what might have been approval. But it doesn't explain why you waited 18 months to assert ownership of your creation. This cut closer to the bone. At first, I was focused on making the technology work. The breakthrough was the goal, not the credit. Then, as CyberShield gained traction internally, Richard's involvement became increasingly proprietary. He began excluding me from strategic meetings, limiting my client exposure, positioning himself as the decision-maker. I leaned forward slightly. It happened so gradually, I almost didn't notice. By the time I realized what was happening, the narrative was already established in many circles. Richard as innovator, me as implementer. Diana nodded thoughtfully. And now? What do you want, Olivia? The question caught me off guard. What did I want? Revenge? Recognition? Compensation? I want what I've earned, I said finally. Credit? For my innovation. The opportunity to lead its continued development. And yes, the career advancement that should come with creating a platform that's already generated $5 million in pre-orders. Diana studied me for a long moment. All reasonable, she acknowledged. But there are complications. My heart sank. Here it came. The corporate politics that would protect Richard despite the evidence. Richard has deep relationships with key clients and board members, Diana continued. He's positioned himself publicly as the face of CyberShield. Unwinding that narrative abruptly could create market confusion and potentially impact the platform's commercial launch. I felt a familiar disappointment settle over me. Even with proof, even with Diana seemingly on my side, business considerations would prevail over fairness. I understand, I said, struggling to keep the resignation from my voice. No, I don't. Think you do, Diana said, surprising me again. I'm not explaining why we can't correct this situation. I'm explaining why we need to approach the correction strategically rather than reactively. She rose from her desk and moved to the window, looking out at the Seattle skyline for a moment before turning back to me. Meridian's board meeting is next Thursday. CyberShield is the centerpiece of our innovation showcase. Richard is currently scheduled to present. She paused, her eyes locked with mine. I think it's time for a change in presenter, don't you? My pulse quickened. You want me to present to the board? I want the actual creator of our most promising new technology to be recognized as such, Diana corrected. Starting with the board, then extending to our client communications and market positioning. Hope bloomed in my chest, quickly tempered by practical concerns. Richard won't accept this quietly. He'll fight back. Diana's expression hardened. Let him try. I don't tolerate intellectual theft in my company, especially not from my leadership team. But, she held up a hand. We'll need to be prepared. The board trusts Richard. He's been presenting to them for years. You'll need to be not just good, but exceptional. I know this technology better than anyone alive, I said, confidence rising. I can present it convincingly to any audience. It's not just the technology, Diana cautioned. The board thinks in terms of market impact, competitive advantage, and revenue generation. Your presentation needs to address the business value as comprehensively as the technical innovation. She was right. I'd been focused on proving my creation of the technology, but that was only half the battle. To truly claim ownership in the eyes of the board, the people who ultimately determined the company's direction and leadership. I needed to demonstrate business vision matching my technical expertise. "I understand," I said. "I'll be ready." Diana nodded, satisfied. "Good. In the meantime, we need to handle Richard. I'll be having another conversation with him shortly, but you should be prepared for resistance." "What kind of resistance?" She considered this. "Best case, he accepts the situation professionally and steps back. Worst case, he tries to undermine your credibility or claim you've stolen his work. Either way, document everything. Forward any concerning communications directly to me." I nodded, already mentally cataloging the evidence I'd gathered. "One more thing," Diana added, her expression softening slightly. "This situation reflects a failure of leadership, mine included. You shouldn't have had to fight for recognition of your own work. I'd like to understand if there are systemic issues I need to address beyond this specific incident." It was an unexpectedly reflective moment from our typically action-oriented CEO. "I appreciate that," I said sincerely. As I stood to leave, Diana remained seated, already turning her attention to her computer. "The board presentation is at 2 p.m. next Thursday. I'll expect your slides for review by Monday morning." "They'll be ready," I promised. "Olivia?" she called as I reached the door. I turned back. "Whatever happens with Richard, remember this. In my experience, people who build things ultimately outlast people who take credit for things." With those words echoing in my mind, I left her office, stepping into a corporate landscape that had shifted dramatically in the span of a single afternoon. News travels fast in any organization, but in a tech company filled with people who communicate primarily through screens, it travels at the speed of light. By the time I returned to my desk, the whispers had already begun. Colleagues glanced my way with newfound curiosity. Natalie had texted 3 times asking for updates. Jason hovered nearby, trying to appear casual while clearly bursting with questions. I ignored them all temporarily, focusing on sending myself secure copies of every piece of evidence I'd gathered. Only when that task was complete did I finally acknowledge Jason's increasingly unsubtle hovering. "So," he prompted, practically vibrating with anticipation. "Not here," I murmured, nodding toward a small conference room. Once inside with the door closed, I gave him a condensed version of what had transpired, watching his expressions shift from concern to surprise to vindication. "Diana's putting you in front of the board?" he repeated, eyes wide. That's huge, Olivia." "If it happens," I cautioned, "Richard still has a week to try to prevent it." Jason shook his head. He wouldn't dare, not now that Diana knows the truth. I wasn't as confident. People with wounded egos can be dangerous, especially when their professional reputation is at stake. And Richard has a lot more allies than I do. "Maybe, but you have something more important," Jason countered. "You have the truth, and you have us, the team that actually built this thing with you." His loyalty touched me. "I may need to call on that support in the coming days," I admitted. "Whatever you need, just say the word. The entire development team has your back." As Jason left to spread the carefully edited news to our colleagues, I sat alone in the conference room trying to process the whirlwind of the past few hours. For nearly 2 years, CyberShield had been the center of my professional life, my passion, my challenge, my creation. Now it had become something else. As well, the battleground for my future at Meridian. My phone buzzed with a notification. An email from Richard, sent to the entire CyberShield team. All CyberShield team members. In light of today's Apex presentation, I'm calling an emergency project alignment meeting tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. Attendance is mandatory for all team members. There seems to be some confusion about project roles and communication protocols that needs immediate clarification. As we move into the critical product launch phase, we cannot afford any further misalignments. Richard Parker, Director of Product Security, Meridian Technologies. The subtext was clear. Richard was planning to reassert control, to establish his narrative before mine could take hold. It was a classic corporate maneuver. Use your authority to call a meeting where your position of power shapes the conversation. But I wasn't the same person who had silently accepted his credit-taking just days earlier. Now I had evidence, I had Diana's support, and most importantly, I had shed my reluctance to fight for what was mine. I typed a quick reply, copying Diana and Michael Thompson, our CTO. Richard, I look forward to the alignment meeting. To ensure complete clarity, I've taken the liberty of inviting Diana and Michael to join us, as their perspective on CyberShield's development history and leadership will be valuable for the entire team. Olivia Chen, Senior Software Architect, Meridian Technologies. My finger hovered over the send button for just a moment before I pressed it. There would be no going back now. Richard's response came within minutes, addressed only to me. Olivia, you're making a serious mistake. This aggressive approach will damage not just your standing at Meridian, but your entire career. I've mentored you, advocated for your ideas, and given you opportunities that few engineers at your level would receive. There's still time to reconsider this path. Meet me privately before tomorrow's meeting, and we can discuss a mutually beneficial resolution. Richard. The thinly veiled threat, coupled with the revisionist history of his mentorship, might have intimidated me a week ago. Now it only strengthened my resolve. I closed his email without responding. Instead, I opened a new document and began outlining my board presentation. If Richard wanted a fight, he would get one, but it would be on ground I controlled, the technology itself. For the next several hours, I immersed myself in crafting a presentation that would not only showcase CyberShield's technical brilliance, but also articulate its business value in terms the board would appreciate. Market analysis, competitor positioning, revenue projections, client testimonials from our pilot program. I pulled together every element that proved both my technical innovation and my business acumen. The sun had long since set over the Seattle skyline when I finally looked up from my work. The office was nearly empty, most of my colleagues having departed hours ago. In the quiet, I found myself reflecting on how I had arrived at this pivotal moment. I thought about my parents, my father, an electrical engineer who had emigrated from Shanghai with nothing but education and determination. My mother, a computer scientist who had battled sexism in tech decades before I entered the field. They had instilled in me a deep reverence for hard work and humility, but also an unyielding belief in fair recognition. Never let anyone steal what you have earned, my mother had told me once, after being passed over for a promotion that went to her male colleague. I thought about my years at Meridian, the nights and weekends sacrificed, the personal relationships neglected, the single-minded focus on solving the quantum security challenge that others considered theoretical. The satisfaction of finally cracking the mathematical problem that had stumped security researchers worldwide. The pride of building something that would protect sensitive data against the coming quantum computing revolution. And I thought about Richard, how easily he had stepped in front of my accomplishment, how confidently he had claimed my innovation as his own, how completely he had expected me to accept my erasure from the narrative. Never again, I promised myself. Never again would I allow someone else to claim what I had built. Never again would I shrink from asserting my rightful place. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. This is Diana. Smart move copying me on the meeting invitation. Come to my office at 7:30 tomorrow, before Richard's meeting. Bring your evidence. I texted back a simple confirmation, then gathered my things to leave. As I walked through the darkened office, a sense of determination settled over me. Not the frantic, emotional energy of earlier, but something cooler and more focused. Tomorrow would be a turning point, one way or another. Richard had the advantage of position and political connections. I had the advantage of truth and creation. In the corporate world, position often prevailed over truth, but not always, not inevitably. Sometimes the person who built the thing really did outlast the person who merely took credit for it. I was about to find out if this would be one of those times. The next morning dawned gray and drizzling, typical Seattle weather that matched my mood. Not gloomy, but serious and determined. I arrived at the office building at 7:15 a.m., much earlier than my usual start time. The lobby was nearly empty, just a few early risers collecting coffee from the ground floor cafe before heading up to their respective floors. I took the elevator to the executive level, where Diana's office was located. This floor had a different atmosphere from the engineering departments below. Quieter, more traditional, with actual walls instead of the open plan layouts that supposedly fostered collaboration, but mostly just created noise. Diana's assistant wasn't at her desk yet, but the door to Diana's office stood open. I knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Come in, Olivia," Diana called, not looking up from her computer. She was already fully immersed in work, a half-empty coffee, cup at her elbow suggesting she'd been there for some time. I entered, closing the door behind me, and took the seat across from her desk. Without preamble, I placed a USB drive on her desk. "Everything's here," I said. "Original research proposal, development logs, code commits, meeting notes, emails, all organized chronologically with an index file explaining the significance of each document." Diana finally looked up, her expression approving. "Thorough. Good." She picked up the drive, but didn't immediately connect it to her computer. Instead, she leaned back slightly, studying me with the same intensity she typically reserved for quarterly financial reports. "How are you planning to handle yourself in Richard's meeting?" she asked abruptly. The question caught me off guard. "Professionally," I said after a moment. "I'll stick to facts, avoid personal accusations, and let the evidence speak for itself. And if he attacks you personally, questions your motives, suggests you're being overly emotional or ambitious?" I understood what she was really asking. As one of the few female executives in the industry, Diana had undoubtedly faced similar tactics throughout her career. "I won't take the bait," I assured her. "This isn't about personalities or feelings. It's about accurate attribution of innovation and leadership." She nodded slightly. "Richard called me last night." My stomach tightened. "And?" "He suggested that you've been under extreme stress lately, that the pressure of the CyberShield launch might be affecting your judgment and behavior." Her tone revealed nothing about whether she found this persuasive. "That's a predictable deflection strategy," I pointed out. "Discredit the person when you can't discredit the facts." "Indeed." A hint of approval crossed her face. "He also implied that your contributions, while valuable, have been exaggerated in your own mind due to your emotional investment in the project." The familiar heat of indignation rose in my chest, but I kept my expression neutral. The documentation speaks for itself. My name is on the original research, the algorithm design, the development leadership. His name appears primarily on status, reports to executives and client-facing materials that were created after the actual innovation was complete. "I know." Diana plugged the USB drive into her computer. "I've been doing my own investigation since yesterday afternoon. The evidence is unambiguous." Relief washed over me. "So what happens now?" "Now," Diana said, turning to her computer. As files from my drive populated her screen, "we go to Richard's meeting and observe how he handles himself when cornered. His response will determine what comes next." She began scanning through the files, occasionally nodding to herself. After a few minutes of silence, she turned back to me. "The board presentation is still yours," she confirmed. "But I want to see how Richard navigates this morning before we determine his future role, if any, with CyberShield and Meridian. A reasonable approach, even if part of me wanted more immediate consequences." "Understood," Diana glanced at her watch. It's nearly 8, shall we? We walked together to the conference room where Richard had scheduled his emergency meeting. The symbolism of arriving alongside the CEO wasn't lost on me. It sent a clear message about where institutional support now lay. As we approached, I could see through the glass walls that most of the CyberShield team was already assembled. Richard stood at the head of the table, papers spread before him, looking considerably more tense than his usual polished self. He was mid-sentence when he noticed us entering, and the momentary falter in his speech was noticeable to everyone. "Diana?" He recovered quickly, professional smile firmly in place. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us this morning." "Olivia? Thought my perspective might be valuable," Diana replied smoothly, taking a seat at the opposite end of the table from Richard, another subtle power move that wasn't lost on the room. "Please continue." Richard's eyes flickered to me briefly as I sat beside Natalie, who squeezed my arm in silent support. The atmosphere in the room was charged with anticipation, everyone sensing that something significant was unfolding. "As I was saying," Richard continued, his voice slightly less confident than before, "there seems to be some confusion about project roles and communication protocols as we move toward the CyberShield launch. Yesterday's situation with the Apex presentation highlighted the need for clarity." He straightened some papers on the table, a nervous gesture I'd never seen from him before. "To be blunt, there have been instances of team members overstepping their defined roles and creating confusion about project leadership." His gaze settled on me. "While collaboration is essential, clear lines of authority are necessary for project success." No one spoke. The team members exchanged uncomfortable glances, aware of the undercurrents but uncertain of how to navigate them. "Moving forward," Richard continued, "all client communications, executive presentations, and board materials related to CyberShield will flow through me for approval before distribution. Technical team members will focus on implementation and bug fixes rather than strategic positioning or client engagement." It was a brazen attempt to reassert control, to put me firmly back in the technical implementer box while he maintained ownership of the strategic and client-facing aspects that drove recognition and career advancement. Before I could respond, Diana spoke up. "That's an interesting perspective, Richard. Before we implement these new protocols, I'd like to clarify something." Her voice was pleasant, but carried unmistakable authority. "Could you remind everyone when and how the CyberShield project originated?" Richard hesitated, sensing the trap but seeing no way to avoid it. "The concept evolved through various research initiatives within the security division," he said carefully. "As department director, I identified the potential of quantum-resistant encryption and authorized resources to explore it further." Diana nodded as if considering this. "And who developed the core algorithm that makes CyberShield unique in the market?" Another hesitation. "It was a collaborative effort," Richard hedged. "My strategic direction guided the technical team's implementation." "I see." Diana turned to me. "Olivia, do you have a different recollection of how CyberShield originated?" All eyes in the room turned to me. This was the moment Richard had tried to prevent. A public airing of the truth before the team that knew it best. I took a deep breath and spoke clearly, keeping my tone factual rather than accusatory. CyberShield began as a research paper I wrote 3 years ago, identifying the coming threat of quantum computing to current encryption standards and proposing a novel algorithmic approach to address it. That paper was initially dismissed as too theoretical, including by Richard. I glanced around the room, making eye contact with team members who had been with the project from early days. When Google's quantum supremacy announcement validated my concerns, I developed a proof of concept on my own initiative. Only then did the project receive official support and resources. Jason nodded confirmation from across the table. Natalie did the same. Other team members began to nod as well. The collective memory of the group validating my account. From that point, I continued, I led the technical development, designed the core algorithm, architected the platform, and personally resolved the mathematical challenges that had stumped other researchers. Richard provided administrative support and handled some client relationship aspects, which was valuable. But he did not conceptualize, design, or develop the fundamental innovation that is CyberShield. The silence that followed was profound. Richard's face had flushed slightly, but his expression remained controlled. Diana let the moment stretch before speaking again. Thank you for that clarification, Olivia. She turned to Richard. It seems there's a significant discrepancy between your characterization of CyberShield's origins and what appears to be the collective understanding of the team who built it. Richard straightened, choosing his words carefully. With all due respect, Diana, technical contributors often lack visibility into the strategic considerations and executive decisions that shape a project's direction. My role as director involves aspects of leadership that may not be apparent to those focused on coding and implementation. It was a subtle attempt to diminish my contribution by characterizing it as merely technical, and by implication, less valuable than his supposed strategic leadership. Diana wasn't having it. Let's be very clear about something, she said, her voice taking on an edge I'd rarely heard. At Meridian Technologies, we value innovation above all else. The person who conceives, designs, and leads the development of a breakthrough technology deserves full recognition for that achievement, regardless of their job title or position in the organizational hierarchy. She looked around the room, making eye contact with each team member. If anyone has information that contradicts the account we've heard regarding CyberShield's development, now is the time to speak up. The invitation hung in the air. Richard looked expectantly at some of the senior team members with whom he had closer relationships, but no one spoke up to support his version of events. The silence was damning. Diana nodded as if this confirmed what she already knew. In light of the evidence and team consensus, we need to make some adjustments to the CyberShield project leadership. She turned to Richard. Effective immediately, Olivia Chen will be recognized as the creator and technical lead of the CyberShield Platform. She will present to the board next Thursday and will be the primary point of contact for strategic client engagements moving forward. Richard's composure finally cracked. This is absurd, he protested, voice rising. You're allowing an engineer with no executive experience to take over a multi-million-dollar product launch based on what? Hurt feelings because she wasn't mentioned prominently enough in a presentation? Based on the fact that she created the technology and has demonstrated a deeper understanding of both its technical aspects and market potential than you have, Diana countered, her tone icy. And based on the fact that taking credit for someone else's innovation violates Meridian's core values. She stood, signaling that her decision was final. Richard, we'll discuss your continued role at Meridian privately. For now, you'll transition all CyberShield materials and client relationships to Olivia. The rest of the team will continue their current responsibilities, reporting to Olivia for technical direction. With that, Diana departed, leaving behind a room humming with the electric charge of corporate hierarchy being spectacularly upended. For a moment, no one moved. Richard remained at the head of the table, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. The team members sat frozen, processing what they had just witnessed. And I felt a strange combination of vindication and discomfort, aware that while justice had been served, a painful human drama was still unfolding. Finally, Richard gathered his papers with sharp, angry movements and strode out without another word. As the door closed behind him, the tension in the room dissolved into an eruption of excited chatter. Natalie turned to me, eyes wide. Did that just happen? Did you just get promoted over Richard's head by the CEO? I think so, I said, still processing it myself. Jason approached, grinning broadly. I knew Diana would see through him eventually. This calls for celebration. But as my teammates expressed their excitement and congratulations, I found myself thinking about what came next. Replacing Richard as the face of CyberShield was only the beginning. Now I had to prove that Diana's faith in me was justified, that I could lead not just the technical development, but the market launch of a platform that represented Meridian's future. The board presentation was still a week away. Richard, wounded but not defeated, still had relationships with board members that predated my time at Meridian. And I had just gone from being an under-the-radar technical contributor to having a very public target on my back. The real test was just beginning. The days following Diana's bombshell announcement passed in a blur of activity. Word of my elevation to CyberShield project lead spread throughout Meridian Technologies with the speed and distortion of a corporate game of telephone. By lunchtime, I was receiving congratulatory emails from people in departments I'd barely interacted with. By the end of the day, the story had morphed from senior engineer recognized for her work to dramatic showdown between director and engineer ends in public firing, despite the fact that Richard had not, to my knowledge, actually been fired. I threw myself into preparation for the board presentation, working longer hours than ever. The irony wasn't lost on me. Now that I had finally received recognition for my work, I was putting in even more time to prove I deserved it. The difference was that now I was working for myself, not to bolster someone else's reputation. Richard had vanished from the office after the meeting, reportedly taking personal time. His absence created a vacuum that I suddenly needed to fill. Client relationships, executive status reports, budget allocations, team management issues, aspects of the project he had handled that I now needed to master rapidly. Natalie appointed herself my unofficial assistant, fielding inquiries and helping me prioritize the flood of new responsibilities. "Email from Westbrook Financial," she reported, perching on the edge of my desk 3 days after the meeting. "They want to confirm next week's demo, and they're specifically asking for Richard." I looked up from the financial projections I'd been revising for the board presentation. What did Marcus tell them? Marcus was our account manager for Westbrook, one of our largest potential clients. "That's the thing," Natalie frowned. "Marcus says Richard had been handling Westbrook personally. Apparently, he told them he was the architect of CyberShield, and they specifically wanted to meet with the creator." I felt a flicker of annoyance. Even absent, Richard was still creating complications. "Schedule a call with Marcus for this." "Afternoon. I need to get up to speed on the Westbrook relationship before responding." Natalie nodded, making a note. "Also, HR wants to meet with you. Something about formalizing your new role and compensation." That was encouraging. Recognition without appropriate compensation would have been a hollow victory. "One more thing," Natalie added, her expression turning serious. "I overheard something in the break room. Apparently, Richard has been calling board members directly." My stomach tightened. "About what?" "No details, but Kelly from executive support said he's been making serious allegations about the CyberShield situation. Of course he had. Richard wouldn't simply accept defeat and fade away, not when his reputation and possibly his career at Meridian were at stake. I had expected counterattacks, but not direct appeals to the board before I'd even had a chance to present to them." "Thanks for the intel," I told Natalie. "Keep your ear to the ground." After she left, I sat back in my chair, considering this new development. Richard's move was predictable, but potentially dangerous. Board members operated at a level far removed from day-to-day engineering realities. They dealt with high-level strategy, financial performance, and market positioning. Most would know Richard as a polished presenter who had been updating them on CyberShield's progress for months. I would be an unknown quantity, if I even got the chance to present at all. I reached for my phone, then hesitated. My instinct was to call Diana, to alert her to Richard's maneuvers. But running to the CEO at the first sign of trouble would hardly demonstrate the leadership capability I was claiming to possess. No, I needed to handle this myself. but strategically. I opened my laptop and navigated to Meridian's Board of Directors page. 8 faces looked back at me, 5 men and 3 women, all with impressive backgrounds spanning technology, finance, and corporate leadership. I needed to understand who they were, what they cared about, and most importantly, who might be most receptive to Richard's narrative. For the next hour, I researched each board member thoroughly, their professional backgrounds, public statements, areas of expertise, and connections to Richard or Diana. A pattern began to emerge. 3 board members had technical backgrounds that would enable them to truly understand CyberShield's innovation. 2 were primarily financial experts who would focus on revenue projections and market strategy. The remaining 3 had broader business backgrounds and would likely be concerned with competitive positioning and client adoption. Most interestingly, 2 board members, James Henderson and Patricia Voss, had made public statements in the past year about the importance of recognizing technical innovation and diverse voices in technology leadership. They would likely be sympathetic to my situation if they understood it accurately. But my research also revealed a potential problem. Robert Cahill, the board's longest-serving member and former CTO of a major security firm, had mentored Richard early in his career. Their relationship went back 15 years, predating either of their tenures at Meridian. If Richard was making calls to board members, Cahill would almost certainly be at the top of his list. I needed more information about what Richard was telling the board, and I needed it quickly. But who would know? The answer came to me suddenly. Diana's executive assistant, Grace, would be aware of board communications and might have insights into what was happening behind the scenes. Grace had been with Diana for over a decade and was renowned for her discretion and comprehensive knowledge of Meridian's inner workings. She was also known to be scrupulously fair and ethical. She wouldn't divulge confidential information, but she might provide general guidance if approached correctly. I sent a brief email requesting 15 minutes of her time, expecting to wait hours or even days for a response. Her reply came within minutes. Stop by at 3 p.m. Short and to the point, just like Grace herself. At precisely 3 p.m., I arrived at Grace's desk outside Diana's office. Unlike many executive assistants who were relegated to small, impersonal workspaces, Grace had a substantial area that reflected her importance in Meridian's power structure. Her desk was immaculate, dual monitors displaying what looked like complex scheduling systems, and a small seating area allowed for private conversations away from passing traffic. Olivia, Grace greeted me with a nod, gesturing to one of the visitor chairs. At around 60, with silver-streaked dark hair cut in a precise bob, Grace had the air of someone who had seen every corporate drama imaginable and was rarely impressed or surprised by any of it. "Thank you for making time," I began, taking the offered seat. "Diana thinks highly of you," she replied simply. "What can I help with?" I considered how to frame my question without appearing to be asking for confidential information. "I'm preparing for next week's board presentation on CyberShield, and I understand there may have been some communication from Richard Parker to board members regarding the project. I want to make sure my presentation addresses any concerns that might have been raised." Grace studied me for a moment, her expression revealing nothing. "You're asking what Richard has been saying about you to the board." Her directness was both refreshing and intimidating. "Yes." She nodded slightly, as if confirming something to herself. "I can't share the content of private communications between executives and board members." "I understand completely," I said, preparing to thank her for her time and leave. "However," she continued, "I can tell you that in my 27 years in executive administration, I've observed that when someone who previously took credit for another's work is exposed, they typically respond in one of 3 ways." I leaned forward slightly, intrigued by this unexpected direction. "The first approach is to admit the error, apologize, and attempt to salvage their reputation through contrition. The second is to quietly exit the situation, often to a new position elsewhere, before the full implications become widely known. She paused. The third is to attack the credibility, motivation, and character of the person they wronged, attempting to reframe the narrative as a power grab by an ambitious subordinate. Her meaning was clear without saying explicitly what Richard was doing. And in your experience, how effective is the third approach? Grace's expression remained neutral, but something like disapproval flickered briefly in her eyes. It depends entirely on the evidence available and the fortitude of the person being attacked. Unsubstantiated accusations rarely succeed against documented facts, but they can create enough doubt to cloud the issue, especially when the accuser has cultivated strong relationships with decision-makers over many years. I nodded, understanding the warning in her words. Richard was almost certainly attempting to discredit me with the board, leveraging his long-standing relationships to cast doubt on my version of events. If someone were in that third situation, I asked carefully, what approach would you recommend? For the first time, a hint of a smile touched Grace's lips. I would suggest they focus on what can be objectively verified rather than subjective interpretations. Present evidence chronologically, with documentation that clearly establishes the evolution of the project and their role in it, and most importantly, demonstrate forward-looking leadership rather than backward-looking grievance. It was exactly the guidance I needed, confirming my instincts about how to approach the situation. That's very helpful. Thank you. Grace glanced at her computer screen. Diana has a call ending in 2 minutes. Was there anything else? I stood, recognizing the polite dismissal. No, that's all. I appreciate your insights. As I turned to leave, Grace added, Olivia. I looked back. The board values substance over style. Remember that. With that cryptic but encouraging advice. I returned to my office, my mind already racing with how to revise my presentation approach in light of what I'd learned. The first order of business was to strengthen the evidence section of my presentation. Instead of simply asserting my role in CyberShield's development, I would create a visual timeline showing the evolution of the project with documented evidence at each stage. My original research paper, initial proof of concept, key technical breakthroughs, and client validation, all with dates and verification. But Grace's final point about substance over style struck me as particularly important. The board wouldn't just be evaluating my claim to CyberShield's creation. They would be assessing whether I had the vision and leadership capability to take it forward. I needed to demonstrate that I wasn't just the technical genius behind the innovation, but also a strategic thinker who understood the business implications. I was deep in these revisions when my phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. Emergency meeting called with CyberShield clients tomorrow morning. Richard back in office. Diana wants to see you ASAP. My stomach dropped. Something had changed, and not for the better. I quickly saved my work and headed for Diana's office, my mind racing through possibilities, none of them good. When I arrived, Diana was standing by the window, her expression grave. She gestured for me to close the door. Richard has escalated matters, she said without preamble. He's filed a formal complaint with HR alleging that you've engaged in intellectual property theft and corporate sabotage. I felt like I'd been punched. That's absurd. The evidence clearly shows. Diana held up a hand. You don't need to convince me. But the accusation triggers a formal investigation process. HR has to follow protocol, especially with something this serious involving a director-level employee. The implications hit me immediately. The board presentation. We'll proceed as planned, Diana assured me. But I won't lie to you. This complicates matters. Richard has also requested the opportunity to present his version of events to the board immediately following your presentation. My hard-won confidence wavered. So it will be my word against his, in consecutive presentations. With evidence on your side, Diana reminded me. But yes, essentially. What about the client meeting tomorrow? I asked, remembering Natalie's text. Diana's expression darkened. That's the immediate concern. Richard has called an emergency meeting with our top 5 CyberShield clients, positioning it as a clarification of project leadership. He's sent the invitations from his director account, giving the appearance of official Meridian business. This was worse than I'd imagined. Richard wasn't just trying to undermine me internally. He was taking the battle to our clients, potentially jeopardizing the relationships I'd need to maintain if I truly took over CyberShield leadership. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, trying to keep the alarm from my voice. "Attend the meeting," Diana said firmly. "I'll be there as well. This is Richard's attempt to publicly reassert control and potentially paint you as a disruptive force to clients who have been dealing primarily with him. We can't allow that narrative to take hold." I nodded, though internally I was anxious about confronting Richard in front of clients. A technical presentation to the board was one thing. That was my territory. But handling a tense client situation with millions in potential revenue at stake? That was new ground. "There's something else you should know," Diana added, her voice softening slightly. "Richard has been suggesting to anyone who will listen that your claim to CyberShield emerged conveniently after it proved commercially viable. That you were happy to work in the background until the platform started generating revenue, and only then decided you wanted recognition and control. The injustice of this characterization stung deeply. That's completely false. I've been trying to get proper recognition for months, but Richard systematically excluded me from client meetings and executive presentations. I only took direct action when he presented my work as his own to the entire leadership team." "I know," Diana assured me, "but it's a narrative that might resonate with people who don't know the full history, especially board members focused on commercialization rather than innovation development." I took a deep breath, calming myself. Getting emotional would only play into Richard's hands. "How should I handle tomorrow's client meeting?" Diana considered this. "Be professional, but direct. Don't attack Richard personally, but don't back down from your position as CyberShield's creator and technical lead. The clients care most about the product's capabilities and ongoing support. Demonstrate your complete command of those aspects." It was solid advice, but executing it while under direct attack would be challenging. "And the HR investigation? Cooperate fully, provide all evidence, and maintain your focus on the board presentation. HR processes take time, but the board's decision on CyberShield's leadership will likely come much sooner." I nodded, trying to project more confidence than I felt. "Understood." Diana studied me for a moment. "Olivia, this was always going to get messy. People like Richard don't relinquish power or recognition without a fight. The fact that he's escalating so dramatically suggests he's panicking. He knows the evidence favors you." That was a perspective I hadn't considered. Richard's aggressive counterattacks could be seen as desperation rather than strength. "Remember," Diana continued, "your greatest advantage is your intimate knowledge of the technology itself. No matter what claims Richard makes about his involvement, he can't fake the depth of understanding that comes from actually building CyberShield." There was wisdom in that observation. I had been so focused on gathering documentary evidence that I'd almost overlooked my most powerful advantage: my comprehensive knowledge of every aspect of CyberShield's design and functionality. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "I'll be ready for tomorrow." As I left Diana's office, a new strategy began to form in my mind. Richard might have relationships with clients and board members that I couldn't match, but he had one critical vulnerability: his limited understanding of how CyberShield actually worked. If I could expose that vulnerability at the right moment, in the right way, his entire position might collapse. The question was how to create that moment without appearing to deliberately ambush him. which could make me look petty or vindictive to clients and board members. I returned to my office and called Jason. "I need your help with something," I told him when he answered. "Actually, I need the whole development team's help." "Name it," he replied without hesitation. "We need to create a technical showcase for tomorrow's client meeting, something that demonstrates CyberShield's capabilities in a way that would require intimate knowledge of the system architecture to explain properly." "A technical trap for Richard," Jason said, immediately understanding my intent. "Not a trap," I corrected, though that was essentially accurate. "An opportunity to clearly establish who truly understands this technology." Jason chuckled. "Same difference. But I'm in. The team will be too. Everyone's tired of Richard taking credit for our work, not just yours." "Great. Let's meet in 30 minutes to plan it out." By that evening, our strategy was set. The development team had created a brilliant technical demonstration that showcased CyberShield's most innovative capabilities, a live simulation of how the system would protect against a quantum computing attack on traditional encryption. The demonstration was elegant and visually impressive, something clients would appreciate, but explaining how it worked required deep knowledge of the mathematical principles and system architecture that only someone who had built it could possess. The next morning, I arrived at the conference room 30 minutes early to set up the demonstration and prepare mentally for the confrontation ahead. Jason and 2 other developers joined me, ostensibly to help with the technical setup, but really providing moral support. "Everything's ready," Jason assured me. "Just remember, you built this. Nobody can take that away from you no matter what they say." I squeezed his arm gratefully. "Thanks for everything." Clients began arriving shortly after. I recognized most of them from previous meetings where I had been introduced as a technical resource rather than the system architect. Some looked surprised to see me taking a leadership role in the setup, others merely curious about the unusual tension they could no doubt sense. Diana arrived next, projecting calm authority as she greeted each client personally. And finally, precisely at the scheduled start time, Richard walked in. He looked immaculate as always, but there was a tightness around his eyes that betrayed his stress. He faltered slightly upon seeing me already positioned at the head of the table, but recovered quickly, smiling warmly at the clients. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began smoothly. I felt it was important to personally address some confusion that may have arisen regarding the CyberShield project leadership. He was attempting to seize control of the narrative immediately. I caught Diana's eye and she gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. We had anticipated this. "Before we discuss organizational matters," I interjected with practiced calm, "I've prepared a demonstration of CyberShield's quantum resistance capabilities that I believe our clients will find valuable. After all, the technology itself is what we're all here for." The clients murmured agreement, and Richard had no choice but to yield the floor or appear obstructionist. He took a seat, his smile fixed, but his eyes wary. I launched into the demonstration, walking the clients through a simulated quantum attack and showing how CyberShield's unique algorithm maintained data security where traditional encryption failed. The clients were visibly impressed, asking technical questions that I answered confidently and comprehensively. "This is fascinating," said the CTO from Westbrook Financial. "But I'm confused about something." He turned to Richard. "In our last meeting, you described yourself as the chief architect of this technology. Yet, Olivia seems to have a remarkable command of the system details." The moment of truth had arrived, and I hadn't even needed to engineer it. The client had done it for me. Richard maintained his professional smile, though I could see panic flickering behind his eyes. "Olivia has been an important technical contributor to the project," he acknowledged. "But as I was about to explain, there's been some internal confusion about project roles that we're clarifying. Perhaps you could clarify by explaining how the quantum resistance algorithm works," I suggested innocently. "Since you led its development, The clients would benefit from your insights. A flicker of alarm crossed Richard's face, quickly suppressed. The technical details are best addressed by implementation specialists, he deflected. My role has been focused on the strategic vision and market positioning. Forgive me, the Westbrook CTO persisted. But when we met last month, you specifically described how you had personally developed the mathematical approach that makes CyberShield unique. You even sketched out the algorithmic concept. He looked confused. Was that not accurate? Richard was cornered. He could either admit he had misrepresented his role or attempt to bluff his way through a technical explanation he wasn't equipped to provide. There seems to be a misunderstanding, Richard began, his composure finally cracking. While I directed the overall development approach, Richard, Diana interrupted gently but firmly, I think it's time for clarity. She turned to the clients. Meridian values transparency with our partners above all else. The fact is that Olivia Chen is the original creator and chief architect of CyberShield. She conceived the initial concept, developed the core algorithm, and has led the technical implementation from the beginning. She paused, letting that sink in. Richard has played an important role in client relationships and business development, but we're correcting an internal misalignment that resulted in confusion about attribution. Moving forward, Olivia will be leading the CyberShield initiative with my full support. A heavy silence fell over the room. The clients exchanged glances, processing this revelation. Richard sat rigid, his career essentially crumbling before his eyes. Finally, the Westbrook CTO spoke again. Well, that explains a lot. He turned to me with newfound respect. The level of innovation in CyberShield is remarkable. I'm glad to know who's really behind it. He extended his hand across the table. I look forward to working directly with you, Olivia. One by one, the other clients expressed similar sentiments. Far from being concerned about the leadership change, they seemed relieved to be connecting with the actual technical mind behind the product they were investing millions to acquire. As the meeting concluded and clients began to depart, Richard remained seated, staring at the table. When only Diana, Richard, and I remained, he finally looked up. You've destroyed my career, he said quietly, addressing both of us but looking at me. I hope you're satisfied. Before I could respond, Diana spoke. You destroyed your own career, Richard. Taking credit for someone else's innovation isn't leadership, it's theft. If you had properly acknowledged Olivia's contribution while focusing on the business aspects you actually handled, we wouldn't be here. Richard stood abruptly. This isn't over. The board still needs to weigh in, and they understand business. Reality's better than idealistic notions of innovation attribution. He gathered his materials and strode out without another word. When the door closed behind him, I exhaled shakily. That was necessary, Diana finished for me, and long overdue. She studied me with something approaching pride. You handled yourself exceptionally well. The technical demonstration was particularly effective. Thank you, I said, feeling a complex mixture of vindication, relief, and lingering anxiety. But Richard's right about one thing. The board still has to decide. Diana nodded. Yes, they do. But after today, I think the momentum has shifted decisively in your favor. She gathered her things. Focus on your presentation. Make it about CyberShield's future, not just about correcting the past. As she left, I remained in the conference room, processing what had just happened. In the span of a week, I had gone from quietly seething in the background to directly confronting my manager in front of major clients with the CEO's support. It was a dramatic reversal of fortune that still felt somewhat surreal. My phone buzzed with a message from Jason. How did it go? I typed back. Richard crashed and burned. Clients are on board with me leading CyberShield. His response came immediately. Never doubted it for a second. Drinks to celebrate? I smiled, despite my lingering tension. Not yet. Board presentation. Still to come. Rain check? Deal, but we will celebrate when this is over. When this is over. The thought resonated with me as I packed up the demonstration equipment. The client confrontation had been a major victory, but the war wasn't won yet. Richard still had his board connections, particularly his mentor Robert Cahill. And his parting words suggested he had something planned for the board presentation. But for the first time, I felt truly confident about the outcome. Not just because the evidence was on my side, or because Diana supported me, or because the clients had responded positively to the leadership change, but because I had finally overcome my reluctance to stand up for myself and my work. I had built CyberShield from nothing but an idea and mathematics. I had solved problems that had stumped security researchers worldwide. I had created something valuable, something that mattered. And no one, not Richard, not the board, not anyone, could take that fundamental truth away from me. With that realization firmly in mind, I headed back to my office to prepare for the final battle, the board presentation that would determine not just CyberShield's future, but my own. The morning of the board presentation arrived with a sense of inevitability. After a week of preparation, client meetings, and navigating Richard's increasingly desperate maneuvers, it felt like everything had been building to this moment. I stood in my apartment, studying my reflection critically. I had deliberately chosen a charcoal gray suit, professional without being flashy, authoritative without trying too hard. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Dress for the position you deserve, not just the one you have. My phone buzzed with a text from Natalie. Team's behind you 100%. Crush it today. I smiled despite my nerves. The support of my colleagues had been unwavering throughout this ordeal. Even team members who had initially stayed neutral had gradually shifted to my side as Richard's tactics became more transparent and desperate. The drive to Meridian's headquarters gave me time to mentally rehearse my presentation one last time. I had restructured it significantly based on Grace's advice, focusing on objective evidence and forward-looking leadership rather than just defending my contribution. The first section established the chronology of CyberShield's development with irrefutable documentation. The middle showcased the technology's capabilities and market potential. The final section outlined my vision for CyberShield's future, new applications, expansion opportunities, and revenue projections that would make any board member sit up and take notice. As I pulled into the parking garage, another text arrived, this one from Diana. Boardroom setup complete. Richard requested presentation order change. He now goes first. I approved. Play still works better as response. See you at 1:30. I felt a momentary flicker of anxiety at this change, but quickly recognized Diana's strategic thinking. Letting Richard present first would allow me to address any accusations or misrepresentations directly in my presentation, rather than having him undermine me after I'd finished. It was actually advantageous, though I suspected Richard had requested the change believing it gave him the upper hand. When I arrived at my office, I found a small package on my desk with a note from Jason, confidence booster, open before showtime. Inside was a custom coffee mug emblazoned with CyberShield Creator and signatures from every member of the development team. It was exactly the emotional lift I needed. The morning passed in a blur of final preparations and one last review with Diana. Remember, she advised as we walked through the executive floor, the board respects achievement and vision above all else. They're not interested in personality conflicts or office politics. Keep the focus on CyberShield's value and your leadership of its development. Any last insights about Richard's angle? I asked. Has he shown his hand at all? Diana's expression darkened slightly. He's been unusually quiet since the client meeting. Robert Cahill has requested a private session with the board immediately following the presentations, which suggests Richard may have convinced him to advocate on his behalf. Cahill's involvement was concerning, but not unexpected. As Richard's longtime mentor and the board's most technically knowledgeable member, his opinion carried substantial weight. "Will I have an opportunity to respond if Cahill raises new allegations?" I asked. "I've ensured that you'll be called back if any substantive questions arise," Diana assured me. "But honestly, I'm more concerned about what Richard might pull." During his presentation, he's desperate, and desperate people take risks. At precisely 1:30 p.m., we entered the boardroom, an imposing space on the top floor with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seattle's skyline. The 8 board members were already seated around the massive table, engaged in quiet conversation. Richard sat near the presentation area, looking outwardly composed but with a tension in his posture that betrayed his stress. Diana made the introductions, keeping her remarks brief and neutral. "As you know, we're here to discuss the CyberShield Platform, which represents Meridian's most significant innovation in quantum-resistant security. You'll hear presentations from both Richard Parker, Director of Product Security, and Olivia Chen, Senior Software Architect and Technical Lead for CyberShield. Following these presentations, I welcome your questions and input on the path forward." With that, she took her seat, and Board Chair Eleanor Montgomery nodded to Richard. "Mr. Parker, please proceed." Richard approached the presentation area with his characteristic polish, but I noticed small tells of anxiety, a slight tremor in his hand as he connected his laptop, a fleeting moment of uncertainty as he surveyed the room. Then, as if donning armor, his professional facade locked into place, and he began. "Members of the board, thank you for your time today. I've had the privilege of updating you on CyberShield's progress over the past 18 months, and I'm pleased to share that we're now ready for full market deployment, with $5 million in pre-orders already secured and projections of $20 million in first-year revenue." He clicked to his first slide, a market analysis showing increasing demand for quantum-resistant security solutions. "When I first conceptualized CyberShield 3 years ago, few in the industry were taking the quantum threat seriously. But I recognized that our traditional encryption methods would soon be vulnerable to emerging quantum computing capabilities." I kept my expression carefully neutral, though internally I was noting how he had immediately positioned himself as the original visionary behind CyberShield. My approach was to develop a mathematical framework that could resist quantum decryption attempts while maintaining compatibility with existing security infrastructure. This conceptual breakthrough became the foundation of the CyberShield platform. Richard continued in this vein for several minutes, describing the development process as if he had personally directed every aspect of it. He was careful to occasionally acknowledge the team's contributions, but always framed as executing his vision and direction, rather than originating any core innovations themselves. It was a masterful performance for anyone who didn't know the truth. Richard spoke with apparent authority about technical details, client relationships, and market positioning. To board members who had been hearing his updates for months, this would seem like a natural continuation of his leadership narrative. Then his presentation took an unexpected turn. "While I'm proud of what we've accomplished with CyberShield, I feel it's my responsibility to address a concerning situation that has emerged in recent weeks," Richard said, his tone shifting to one of reluctant duty. "As leaders of this company, you deserve complete transparency about events that could potentially impact Meridian's reputation and client relationships." He clicked to a new slide titled Development Timeline, Facts versus Claims. My stomach tightened as I realized what was coming. Recently, a member of the technical team has begun claiming primary authorship of CyberShield. While this individual made valuable contributions to implementing the system architecture I designed, these claims represent a significant distortion of the project's actual development history. Richard displayed a series of cherry-picked email excerpts and meeting notes that, taken out of context, suggested he had been directing the project from its inception. It was a clever manipulation. Nothing shown was technically false, but the selective presentation created a deeply misleading impression. I believe this situation stems from a misunderstanding of how innovation actually works in a corporate environment, Richard continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. True innovation isn't just about writing code or solving mathematical problems. It's about strategic vision, market insight, and business leadership. It's about recognizing opportunities and marshaling resources to capitalize on them. This broader perspective is often lost on those with a purely technical focus. I felt a flash of anger at this dismissive characterization of technical innovation, but kept my expression impassive. Robert Cahill was watching me closely, clearly, gauging my reaction. More concerning is the potential impact on our client relationships, Richard continued. Several major clients have expressed confusion about the sudden change in project leadership just as we're entering the critical deployment phase. This creates needless market uncertainty and risks destabilizing the very client relationships I've spent 18 months cultivating. This was a blatant misrepresentation. After the client meeting earlier that week, all of our major clients had expressed support for my leadership of CyberShield. Richard was counting on the board not having direct knowledge of those interactions. I bring this situation to your attention not out of personal concern, but because it represents a significant risk to CyberShield's market success and Meridian's reputation for stable, professional leadership. Innovation requires proper attribution, yes, but also proper understanding of the difference between technical contribution and visionary leadership. With that final barb, Richard concluded his presentation. There was a moment of silence as the board absorbed what they had heard. I noticed several members glancing between Richard and me, clearly reassessing the situation in light of his accusations. Eleanor Montgomery broke the silence. "Thank you, Mr. Parker. That was illuminating. Ms. Chen, are you prepared to present now?" I rose, my heart pounding, but my resolve steady. "Yes, Chairwoman Montgomery, I am." As I moved to the presentation area, I could feel the weight of scrutiny from every board member. Richard's presentation had effectively framed me as an ambitious engineer, trying to claim credit beyond my contribution. Exactly the narrative I had anticipated, but still unsettling to hear delivered so convincingly. I connected my laptop, took a deep breath, and looked directly at the board members. "Thank you for the opportunity to address you today. I'm Olivia Chen, Senior Software Architect and the creator of CyberShield." The directness of my opening statement caused several board members to sit up straighter. I had deliberately eschewed a cautious or defensive beginning, choosing instead to state my position clearly and confidently. I recognize that my perspective differs significantly from what you just heard. Rather than asking you to simply take my word over Mr. Parker's, I'd like to present objective, documented evidence of CyberShield's development history. I clicked to my first slide, a chronological timeline of CyberShield's evolution with supporting documentation for each major milestone. 3 years ago, I submitted this research paper to Meridian's innovation program, I said, displaying the original document with my name and submission date clearly visible. It identified the coming quantum security threat and proposed a novel, mathematical approach to address it. Initially, this proposal was deemed too theoretical and not aligned with market demands. I clicked to the next slide, showing Richard's email response to my initial proposal, which stated exactly those criticisms. Several board members leaned forward, their interest visibly piqued by this direct contradiction to Richard's narrative. 6 months later, when Google announced their quantum supremacy breakthrough, the threat I had identified suddenly became a priority. At that point, I was authorized to form a small team to develop my concept further. I methodically walked through each phase of CyberShield's development, displaying documentation that clearly established my role as the primary architect and technical lead. Development logs, code repositories, meeting minutes, technical specifications, all with timestamps and attribution that couldn't be disputed. Particularly damning was an email from Richard himself to Diana from early in the project. Olivia's quantum-resistant approach is showing remarkable promise. Her mathematical innovation could position Meridian ahead of competitors by years if we provide adequate resources. I noticed Robert Cahill studying this evidence with particular intensity, his expression thoughtful as he compared what he was seeing with Richard's version of events. After establishing the factual timeline, I shifted to a technical overview of CyberShield's architecture. The core innovation that makes CyberShield unique is its approach to lattice-based cryptography. Unlike traditional post-quantum solutions that sacrifice performance for security, I developed a mathematical framework that maintains efficiency while providing quantum resistance. I deliberately used technical language that demonstrated deep expertise, knowing that Cahill in particular would recognize genuine understanding versus surface-level familiarity. When I glanced at Richard, I could see him shifting uncomfortably as I delved into mathematical concepts he couldn't possibly explain himself. Having established both the history and technical foundation, I moved to the final section of my presentation, the future vision for CyberShield. While securing $5 million in pre-orders is an excellent start, it represents just the beginning of CyberShield's potential, I said, displaying market projections more ambitious than even Richard had claimed. Beyond our current financial sector focus, I've identified 3 additional vertical markets where our technology has immediate application, potentially expanding our first-year revenue to $30 million rather than $20. I outlined a strategic roadmap for CyberShield that extended well beyond what Richard had presented: new applications, technical enhancements, and market opportunities that showcased both technical vision and business acumen. Technical innovation and business leadership aren't separate domains, I said, directly addressing Richard's implied criticism. They're interconnected aspects of truly transformative technology. Understanding the mathematics that makes CyberShield possible is precisely what enables me to envision its broader applications and market potential. As I concluded my presentation, I noticed something unexpected. Several board members were nodding slightly, and even Robert Cahill was making notes with focused attention. "Thank you for your consideration," I finished simply. "I'm happy to address any questions." Eleanor Montgomery glanced around the table. "I think we have quite a few questions, Ms. Chen. Let's start with the apparent contradiction between your account and Mr. Parker's regarding the origin of CyberShield. Mr. Cahill, you have expertise in this area. Would you like to begin?" Robert Cahill leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Chen, your presentation suggests you developed the core mathematical framework independently. Yet Mr. Parker has been briefing us for months on his leadership of this innovation. How do you explain this discrepancy?" It was the question I had been waiting for. The documentation speaks for itself, Mr. Cahill. My original research paper predates Mr. Parker's involvement by 6 months. The mathematical approach that makes CyberShield unique is documented in that paper. What changed was not who created the innovation, but who presented it to this board. Cahill nodded slowly. "In your opinion, what contributed to this misattribution?" I chose my words carefully. In many organizations, technical innovators aren't always the ones who communicate with executive leadership. As CyberShield gained traction, Mr. Parker increasingly positioned himself as its creator in executive communications, while limiting my visibility to client and leadership interactions. By the time I realized the extent of this misrepresentation, it had already become the accepted narrative in many circles. Patricia Voss, one of the board members with a technical background, spoke next. "Ms. Chen, could you explain the specifics? Mathematical innovation that makes CyberShield resistant to quantum attacks?" "In technical terms, please." This was my opportunity to demonstrate knowledge that Richard couldn't possibly possess. I launched into a detailed explanation of the lattice-based cryptographic approach I had developed, complete with mathematical notation and algorithmic concepts. When I finished, Voss turned to Richard. Mr. Parker, would you care to elaborate on any aspect of the mathematical framework Ms. Chen just described? Richard's face paled slightly. As I mentioned in my presentation, my role has been focused on strategic direction rather than implementation details. I leave the mathematical specifics to the technical team. Voss's expression made it clear this evasion hadn't gone unnoticed. Yet earlier you described conceptualizing the mathematical framework yourself. Which is it? Before Richard could respond, James Henderson, the board's financial expert, intervened. Let's set aside attribution questions for a moment. Ms. Chen, your revenue projections exceed Mr. Parker's by a significant margin. What's the basis for your more optimistic outlook? I was prepared for this. My projections include 3 additional market verticals that weren't included in Mr. Parker's analysis: healthcare compliance, critical infrastructure, and defense contracting. Because I understand CyberShield's technical capabilities intimately, I can identify application opportunities that might not be apparent to someone with a more surface-level understanding of the technology. I displayed a detailed breakdown of revenue projections by market segment, with adoption timelines and pricing models for each. Henderson studied these numbers with clear interest. These projections appear well-reasoned, he acknowledged, though ambitious. Ambitious but achievable, I countered. The $5 million in pre-orders we've already secured came from just 7 financial institutions. My projections are based on a potential client base of over 200 organizations across multiple sectors with conservative adoption rates. The questions continued for nearly an hour, with board members probing both the technical aspects of CyberShield and the business strategy I had outlined. Throughout, I maintained calm confidence, answering directly and substantively without appearing defensive. Richard attempted to interject several times with clarifications or alternative perspectives, but each time found himself undermined by his limited technical understanding or contradicted by the documentary evidence I had presented. Finally, Eleanor Montgomery held up a hand. I think we've covered considerable ground. Before we deliberate, do either of you have any final remarks? Richard spoke first, his tone carefully measured. I want to emphasize that innovation is a collaborative process. While individual contributions are important, and I've never denied Ms. Chen's technical value to the project, true leadership involves much more than coding or mathematics. It requires business vision, client relationship management, and executive decision-making. These aspects shouldn't be discounted in favoring technical contribution over strategic leadership. It was a last-ditch attempt to frame the discussion as technical contribution versus business leadership rather than truth versus misrepresentation. I waited for him to finish before offering my response. I agree completely that innovation requires both technical excellence and business vision, I began, deliberately finding common ground before making my final point. What I've demonstrated today is that I possess both. The technical foundation of CyberShield is undeniably my creation, as the documentation clearly shows. But I've also presented a comprehensive business strategy that extends beyond our current market position to new opportunities and revenue streams. I paused, making eye contact with each board member. The question isn't whether technical innovation matters more than business leadership. The question is who actually provided both for CyberShield. The evidence speaks for itself. With that, Montgomery thanked us both and asked us to wait outside while the board deliberated. As we exited the boardroom, Diana joined us in the waiting area, her expression giving nothing away. The 3 of us sat in uncomfortable silence. Richard stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Diana reviewed notes on her tablet. I tried to calm my racing thoughts, mentally reviewing my performance and wondering if I had done enough to overcome Richard's months of narrative building with the board. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably closer to 20 minutes, Robert Cahill emerged from the boardroom and approached us. "The board would like to speak with each of you individually," he announced. "Ms. Chen, please come in first." Richard's head snapped up, surprise and alarm crossing his face. Typically, the more senior person would be called in first. The fact that the board wanted to speak with me first suggested something significant had shifted. Heart pounding, I followed Cahill back into the boardroom. The atmosphere had changed. There was a sense of resolution rather than inquiry. Eleanor Montgomery gestured for me to take a seat directly across from her. "Ms. Chen, the board has reviewed both presentations and the supporting evidence. We've also considered Diana's input regarding recent events with the CyberShield client base." Montgomery's tone was formal, but not cold. "The documentation you've provided leaves little room for interpretation regarding the origins of CyberShield's core innovation." A wave of relief washed over me, though I maintained my professional composure. "However," Montgomery continued, "attribution of innovation is only part of our consideration. We're equally concerned with CyberShield's successful market deployment and Meridian's leadership structure moving forward. With that in mind, we have several questions about your readiness to assume formal leadership of the CyberShield initiative." For the next 15 minutes, the board questioned me about everything from client relationship management to team leadership to strategic decision-making. These weren't technical questions, but leadership ones, probing my ability to guide CyberShield beyond its development phase into successful market deployment. Finally, Montgomery nodded, apparently satisfied. "Thank you, Ms. Chen. Please ask Mr. Parker to join us and wait with Diana until we've concluded our discussions." I left the boardroom with renewed hope, but also lingering uncertainty. The board had acknowledged my creation of CyberShield, but seemed concerned about the transition in leadership and its potential impact on the project's success. Richard entered the boardroom without making eye contact with me. Diana raised an eyebrow questioningly, and I gave her a cautious nod. Things seemed positive, but nothing was certain yet. Richard's meeting with the board lasted longer than mine, nearly 30 minutes. When he finally emerged, his expression was rigid with suppressed emotion. Without acknowledging either of us, he walked directly to the elevator and departed. "That's not the face of someone who got what he wanted," Diana observed quietly. Before I could respond, Robert Cahill appeared at the boardroom door. "Diana, Olivia, the board would like to speak with both of you now." We entered together, taking seats side by side across from the board leadership. Eleanor Montgomery wasted no time on preliminaries. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimony, the board has reached several conclusions regarding CyberShield and its leadership, she announced. First, we formally acknowledge Olivia Chen as the original creator and chief architect of the CyberShield technology. The documentation is unambiguous on this point. I felt a surge of vindication, but kept my expression professionally restrained. Second, we recognize that a significant breach of Meridian's values occurred when credit for this innovation was misattributed in executive communications and client interactions. This is inconsistent with our commitment to integrity and recognition of intellectual contribution. Montgomery turned her attention specifically to me. "Ms. Chen, the board is impressed not only with your technical achievement, but with the business vision and strategic thinking you demonstrated today. Your proposed expansion of CyberShield into additional market segments presents compelling growth opportunities that we believe should be pursued." She then addressed Diana. "In light of these findings, the board authorizes the following actions. Olivia Chen is to be promoted to Director of Quantum Security Initiatives, with primary responsibility for CyberShield's continued development and market deployment. She will report directly to you, Diana, bypassing the normal organizational structure." My breath caught. This was beyond what I had hoped for. Not just recognition, but promotion to a director-level position with direct reporting to the CEO. "Regarding Richard Parker," Montgomery continued, her expression hardening slightly, We leave disciplinary measures to your discretion, Diana, but the board's position is that his actions regarding CyberShield were unacceptable and inconsistent with Meridian's leadership standards. Diana nodded, glancing at me with the barest hint of a smile. I understand the board's position and will take appropriate action. One final matter, Montgomery added. Ms. Chen, the board was particularly impressed with your $30 million revenue projection for CyberShield's first year. We are formally adopting this as the target for the initiative, with appropriate compensation incentives tied to achievement of these numbers. It was both a vote of confidence and a challenge. They believed in my vision, but would hold me accountable for delivering on it. Thank you, Chairwoman Montgomery, I responded. I appreciate the board's confidence and look forward to exceeding those projections. As the meeting concluded and we left the boardroom, the full impact of what had just happened began to sink in. In the span of a week, I had gone from unrecognized technical contributor to director-level leader with formal acknowledgement as CyberShield's creator. Diana waited until we were in the elevator before speaking. Congratulations, Director Chen. That went about as well as we could have hoped. Thank you, I said, still processing the outcome. What happens with Richard now? Diana's expression turned serious. He'll be transitioning out of Meridian. The board left the details to me, but after what transpired, there's no path forward for him here. The elevator reached the executive floor and Diana stepped out. Take the rest of the day. Tomorrow, we'll meet to discuss your transition and team structure. The real work is just beginning. As the doors closed and I continued down to the main floor, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Vindication, yes, but also responsibility for what came next. I had fought for recognition of my creation and won far more than that. Now I had to prove that I deserved not just credit for CyberShield's past, but leadership of its future. Outside the building, the Seattle afternoon had turned surprisingly sunny, a rarity this time of year. I took a moment to simply stand in the warmth, letting the events of the day settle within me. My phone buzzed with a message from Jason. Well, I smiled and typed back, you can order those drinks now. I'm buying. His response came instantly. Yes. Details needed immediately. Celebration at the Overlook at 7? Perfect, I replied. And Jason? Thank you. I couldn't have done this without the team's support. As I walked to my car, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. Just weeks ago, I had watched silently as someone else claimed credit for my innovation. Now I was stepping into a leadership role that would shape not just CyberShield's future, but my own career trajectory. The battle had been difficult and at times painful, but ultimately necessary. Some lessons couldn't be learned theoretically, they had to be lived. I had learned that creating something valuable wasn't enough. You also had to be willing to stand up and claim ownership of your creation. That professional humility, while admirable, shouldn't extend to allowing others to take credit for your achievements. And perhaps most importantly, that sometimes fighting for recognition isn't just about personal validation, but about establishing the truth that enables the right path forward. With those thoughts in mind, I drove away from Meridian's headquarters, not as the overlooked engineer whose work had been claimed by someone else, but as the newly acknowledged creator and director of the company's most promising innovation. The real work, as Diana had said, was just beginning. But for the first time in my career, I would be doing that work in the light, not in someone else's shadow. 6 months after the board presentation, I stood at the podium in Meridian's largest conference room, preparing to announce CyberShield's official market launch. The room buzzed with energy. Investors, clients, industry analysts, and my team, all gathered to witness what had become Meridian's most successful product launch in company history. Good afternoon, I began, surveying the eager faces. Today marks a milestone not just for Meridian Technologies, but for data security in the quantum age. My gaze fell on my parents in the front row, my father beaming with unmistakable pride, my mother with tears shimmering in her eyes. They had flown in from San Francisco specifically for this moment. Behind them sat Diana, her usually stoic expression softened by the hint of a satisfied smile. When I first identified the quantum vulnerability in traditional encryption methods 3 years ago, many considered it a theoretical problem for the distant future. Today, CyberShield stands as the industry's first comprehensive solution to this imminent threat. The presentation flowed smoothly as I outlined CyberShield's capabilities, client success stories, and our roadmap for the coming year. The nervousness that had plagued me during that pivotal board presentation was long gone, replaced by the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own creation intimately. I'm pleased to announce that CyberShield has not only met, but exceeded, our projected targets, with $34 million in confirmed contracts and an additional $20 million in the final negotiation stages. The audience erupted in applause. Those numbers represented not just financial success, but validation of my vision for CyberShield's broader applications beyond the financial sector. We had successfully expanded into healthcare, critical infrastructure, and government security. All markets Richard had dismissed as not immediately viable. As I concluded my presentation and the room filled with applause, I felt a profound sense of completion. This moment, standing publicly acknowledged as CyberShield's creator and leader, represented the culmination of a journey that had tested me professionally and personally. Later, at the reception, Diana approached me with 2 champagne flutes. "To exceeding expectations," she said, handing me one. "Thank you," I replied, clinking my glass against hers. "For everything." She shook her head slightly. "You did this, Olivia. I just removed the obstacles." "Have you heard anything about Richard?" I asked. It was the first time I'd mentioned his name in months. "He's at Westmark Systems now," Diana said. "Interestingly, in a purely business development role, not technical leadership." I nodded, feeling neither satisfaction nor resentment at this news. Richard had simply become a chapter in my story, not its defining element. "You know," Diana mused, "we never discussed why you didn't speak up sooner. 18 months is a long time to watch someone else take credit for your work." The question gave me pause. "I think I needed to learn something first," I said finally. "That innovation without advocacy is incomplete. That sometimes standing up for your work isn't ego. It's necessary for the work itself to succeed." Diana studied me thoughtfully. A valuable lesson, though an expensive one in time and peace of mind. "Maybe," I conceded, "but I'm not sure I would have been ready for this role without that experience." I gestured to the room full of clients and colleagues now looking to me for leadership. It changed how I see myself and what I'm capable of. As Diana moved away to greet investors, Natalie appeared at my side. "So, Director Chen, what's next? You've revolutionized encryption, exceeded financial projections, and basically become Meridian's rising star. Planning to coast for a while?" I laughed, genuinely amused by the suggestion. "Actually, I have some thoughts about quantum-resistant blockchain applications, and I'm putting together a proposal for an innovation incubator within Meridian, a formal pathway for engineers to develop and receive recognition for their ideas." "Of course you are," Natalie grinned, never satisfied. "Just getting started," I corrected her. Later that evening, after the excitement had died down and the reception had ended, I found myself alone in my office, now a spacious corner space on the executive floor with views of both the Seattle skyline and the Puget Sound. On my desk sat the coffee mug Jason had given me before the board presentation, CyberShield Creator, still emblazoned across its side. I picked it up, turning it in my hands thoughtfully. The journey from watching Richard claim my work to standing recognized as CyberShield's creator and director had transformed me in ways I was still discovering. I had learned to advocate for myself without apology. to recognize my own value even when others attempted to diminish it. To understand that sometimes the most important battles aren't just about winning, but about establishing truth that enables the right path forward. Most importantly, I had learned that innovation isn't just about creating something new. It's about shepherding that creation into reality in a way that honors its potential. Sometimes that means fighting for recognition. Sometimes it means challenging those with more power or authority. And sometimes it means simply refusing to step aside when someone tries to claim what you've built. As I placed the mug back on my desk and prepared to leave for the day, I felt not just satisfaction with how things had turned out, but excitement for what came next. The battle for CyberShield had never really been about titles or recognition alone. It had been about establishing who could best lead it forward. Now that question was answered, and the real work could continue. The work of innovation, the work of leadership, and most importantly, the work of creating something meaningful in a world that desperately needed new solutions to emerging challenges. That work, my work, was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.